Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on in 2020. And today we have someone who's going to talk about labor in the Greens, Ukraine, and eco-socialism within the Green parties of the world. And his name is Matthew Hull. He's the Trade Union Liaison Officer for the Green Party of England and Wales. He joined the Green Party in 2014, and he's been on the executive committee of the Green Party of England and Wales since 2022. And he was formerly a member of the executive committee of the Young Greens, the party's youth wing, and he sat on the committee of the London Federation of Green Parties. He's a union member. He's a member of Unite the Union, and he can explain that, and also the Independent Workers Union of Great Britain. And previously, he worked as a fundraiser for nonprofits where he acted as the Unite shop steward there. So Matthew, thanks for coming on. We met when I was in London, and it was great talking to you. And you gave, I'm going to put this in one of my dispatches from Europe when I get around to it. You had a great little statement to a meeting, a demonstration of trade unionists and their supporters from Hong Kong, where the trade unions have been smashed since the Chinese government basically crushed what was left of democracy in Hong Kong. And, that really struck me because the Green Party in the United States doesn't have anything like that. So why don't you explain, what you do as a trade union liaison officer and how the Green Party of England and Wales relates to the trade union movement?
Of course. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on, Howie. It's a great pleasure, and it was great to meet you in December as well. As you've mentioned, I'm currently the Green Party of England and Wales Trade Union Liaison Officer, and I sit on the party's National Executive Committee, which manages the party's sort of business on a sort of day-to-day basis. So it sets budgets, employs staff, that kind of thing. So the Trade Union Liaison Officer role has existed for quite some time now. It was created in the mid-2000s at the initiative of a group of members in the party who wanted to see labour issues and trade union issues represented in the party structures. And it's also quite common in various Labour Party branches, and I believe it's just routine to have an officer of the local party that is responsible for managing relationships with the affiliated unions, that is the trade unions that support the local Labour Party branch. And so the idea was to create this role within the Green Party of England and Wales that could act as a sort of link and helped us build and develop those relationships with Britain's trade unions. And so that's the role I've had since 2022. And as part of that, I do a bunch of work essentially trying to sort of facilitate better relationships, especially between the party at a national level and trade unions at a sort of higher level, trying to ensure that we're working together on policies, that we're taking the unions lead on various issues where they have expertise and where their members' livelihoods and communities are at stake. But also, part of the role is to work with local Green parties as well, to encourage them to build relationships with trade union members at a grassroots rank and file level. And in my opinion, that's where the most important work happens for the Green Party, and that's where most of our energy should be focused at the moment. And it's important to recognise that when I'm doing that work, I'm very much part of a much larger group. So while I sit on the party's executive committee, and that's really good that we have that role, I also work with a load of rank and file trade unionists in the party, especially through the Green Party Trade Union Group. And in that way, we support local Green parties to really make trade union issues their local Green Party campaigning issues, and to build on the necessary links, I think, between Green Party campaign objectives and the objectives of the Labour movement.
Well, we have an article that you wrote about why the Greens must stand with the trade unions, and links to a couple of the trade union groups things on the web. So let's get that in the chat while we're talking here. It's interesting because I have the same approach that recommend the same approach for Greens in this country. I mean, like the Labor Party and the trade unions in Britain are kind of joined at the hip. Here it's with the Democratic Party, which is even, as one pundit said, this world's second most enthusiastic capitalist party after the Republicans. And so, it's difficult to relate to the unions, particularly the internationals, as we call them, the national body, basically, because they're so invested in the Democratic Party. But at the local level, locals will often endorse Green candidates. But what you're really interested in, I think, is working with the rank and file. So talk about, how that works out with the unions and their, historic orientation to the Labor Party.
Yeah, of course. It's really interesting to hear the American perspective, especially. I think here in the UK, it's even stronger. I mean, the institutional link between, especially Labour-affiliated trade unions, of which there are a certain number. I forget the exact number. Those are unions which are sort of formally linked to the British Labour Party, for listeners who might not be aware, and for whom supporting the Labour Party is very much sort of part of their constitutional makeup. And so those unions, especially at an official level, at a higher bureaucratic level, are very much joined to the British Labour Party at the hip and are very much unable to support other parties that might compete with it. And so, as you can imagine, when trying to work with especially the bureaucracies of those unions and elected officials within those unions, it can be quite difficult, I think, to establish a really sort of easy relationship, simply because they have that established relationship with Labour. But it must be said that doesn't mean that there can't be any working. After all, trade unions to varying extents are bound to act in the interests of their members, and quite often it will be in their members' interests for the Green Party to reflect the best of union policy, or to follow a trade union's line on a particular matter, for instance. So even working with the elected officials, the general secretaries, people of that nature, is very much something that we can do with Labour-affiliated unions. And then looking more broadly, there are so many trade unions that aren't affiliated with the Labour Party. There are so many rank and file trade unionists who, even if they happen to be members of the Labour Party, are more than happy to work with local campaigners if they see that as a way of achieving their goals. And so I think the future for, or at least in the short term, for the Green Party in England and Wales is really to focus on building those relationships at a local and regional level, starting to develop something of a common shared way of working, and also to develop a common program that we can really get behind on a local level. And I think it's by doing all of that work together over a period of time that we can start to build up the kind of trust that would be needed to continue to work together in a much more substantial and official way going forward. And who knows, maybe in the future that could look like something more formal, a more formal strategic relationship on a national level as well. But I think that's very much something we've got to work towards. And I think really the onus is on us as Greens to demonstrate that we can be really effective, generous, and comradely partners to our siblings in the trade union movement. And so I think it really sits with us.
Yeah, I think that would be good advice for Greens who are in trade unions in the United States. Build relationships from below. In Britain, I mean, in the socialist tradition, independent political action, class independence, is something that the American left has lost, for the most part. They've been in the Democratic Party since the communists set up the Popular Front in the 30s. In Britain, socialists can say, well, Labor's an independent party with a socialist heritage, as watered down as it has become. So in a way, you have a tougher problem than we do if you're trying to speak to socialist-oriented trade unionists. The other thing that's different here is that I expect your union density is much higher than ours. We're down to 11.9% of the workforce in unions and only 5.9% in the private sector.
Yeah.
And now Trump is trying to destroy the public sector unions, certainly the federal unions. He's just said they can't collectively bargain. Not that he can legally do that, but he's said it, and he's trying to rule by fiat. So I think, talk about how you approach, socialists in the trade unions when they say, well, we have an independent party. Why should they leave the Labor Party for the Green Party? How does that discussion go?
Yeah, I think that's a really keen observation. I think rhetorically, you're right that, the Labour Party, the fact that it has that heritage of being a party with socialists in it, which is often how it's described, but being a party that was created by and for trade unionists, not all of them socialists. There's quite a diverse sort of political heritage there. But Labour, as being the party that was created by trade unionists in the late 19th century to further the objectives of the trade unions, I think really does present itself as a rhetorical response when I might go to people and say, look, the Labour Party isn't working in our class's interests. What are we going to do about that? I think that there can be responses that you can make. I think you can really point to the recent history of the Labour Party. I think you can point to a changing political, economic, and class makeup in the UK and make a convincing case that things aren't quite what they were, and that trade unions need to be more flexible and more savvy in their approach to political contest and what they do there. When we look at union density in the UK, off the top of my head, I'd have to go and check, but off the top of my head, density will still be in the sort of low to mid 20s across the whole economy. So maybe sort of in rough terms, about sort of twice as high as it is in the United States. But like in the United States, much of that for us rests in the public sector. And while public sector union density has in fact been growing gradually in the past few years, and so union density across the economy has also been growing. Private sector density has been falling dramatically. And that's particularly acute for trade unions like mine, Unite, which covers workers in the public and private sector, but relies on private sector workers to make up most of its membership. So in terms of dealing with those difficult conversations, which is where your question started, I think it's really a case, I like to think of it as sort of doing rather than merely explaining. There are so many times that I can explain that, the Labour Party is consistently failing to deliver on trade unions' objectives. It's failed to repeal Margaret Thatcher's anti-trade union laws, which really smashed trade unions and which helped to cause this precipitous drop in union density. I can talk about the way in which Labour has failed to protect the communities that trade unions serve and has failed to protect their working class members by cutting benefits, by overseeing stagnation in wages, and so on and so forth. But I really think that in combination with those arguments, I think you have to address the fact that Labour has this long-standing institutional connection and this emotional connection with trade unionists as well. And I think when we're approaching people as Greens, we need to be prepared to undertake, I think, the sort of really hard and longer term work of building constructive relationships with people. And I think it's by doing that you can show that the Green Party can actually be an alternative to this Labour Party, which has been failing people for so long. So I suppose the way I describe it is that it's as much a sort of practical effort as it is a conversation to be had. And that's one that I think we simply need to keep on pushing ahead with.
Yeah, again, I think you keep coming back to building relationships with people in the unions. And for Greens, that means local unions. And I know when I've got endorsements, it's often been on the basis of my personal relationships with people. Because we've talked over the years through several campaigns, and they see where I stand, and they know I come out for them when they have a job action, and then it becomes possible. And given who the Democrats really are, they're really not friends of labor, locally or nationally. Yeah. you can move people, but it starts with the relationship, which is the thing that we need to know and understand as organizers.
Yeah. And actually, if I could just
Sure.
jump in a bit, I mean, one thing that is quite noticeable is that while at a national or even sort of regional level, a lot of union staff members, a lot of elected officials, high up elected officials in trade unions, like general secretaries, will be quite concerned with influencing either the current government or the next government if an election's coming up. And clearly, before last summer, when we still had a Conservative government in the UK, a lot of trade unions were looking to the general election and thinking, well, maybe Labour will come into government and they'll deliver on some of our priorities. They have brought in an employment rights bill, although the employment rights bill is deficient in a great many ways, and many trade unions have not been shy in criticising it. But at least when the unions could look forward to a change in government and they could say, oh, well, we need to be friendly with Labour so that Labour will deliver on our priorities, then at least those trade unions could take that attitude. But I think now that Labour are in government and are failing to deliver, and now that we have the prospect potentially of Nigel Farage and his ilk rising to prominence after the next election, I think trade unions are faced with a completely different set of decisions to make. And I think it's one in which they could really build a constructive partnership with the Green Party as a left-wing opposition. So I think in a sense, there is something of an opportunity there now that wasn't there for Greens in Britain maybe even just a year ago.
Yeah, I want to respond to a comment that was in the chat from Chris Blankenhorn, because it relates to what we're talking about right now. He said, we've had multiple attempts, there it is, to start a union labor-oriented formation in the Green Party of the United States in my decade with the party. Unfortunately, none of them have taken off. And I've been drawn into these efforts. They've been going on maybe over the last 2 decades. And I always end up with a problem because too many people in the Green Party and the national leadership think this should be about going to talk to the union tops, leaders in the national unions. Maybe the unions that sometimes talk about independent politics, like one of the postal workers unions or the United Electrical Workers. And I've said, the unions are not going to lead a breakaway from the Democratic Party. They won't leave until the Greens are strong enough that they're a viable option. And what we should be oriented to doing is building these relationships locally, getting involved in reform caucuses to democratize our unions, which are very top-down in most cases, and then radicalizing them in the sense of, bringing resolutions and getting right at the grassroots level, getting the membership to debate questions like arms to Palestine or arms to Ukraine, support arms to Ukraine, oppose them to Palestine or to Israel for Palestine. And that's, in the course of those discussions, you build those relationships. So I think, the efforts in the Green Party of the United States have failed because the people that have called for it, I mean, Jill Stein has been, talking about doing this coming out of her campaign. And, I said back to them, we got to have an organized way of going into the unions with a common program of democratization and working at the local level. And, I sort of, that's my last contribution to the conversation. I don't know where it's gone since then, but I've been left out of it. So that's just, my comment on what's been going on in this country. Is there anything more you want to say about the unions and the Green Party in the UK, or should we move on to the question of Ukraine solidarity?
Well, I think if it's okay, if I got a couple of minutes,
Sure.
I'd really like to, just highlight a couple of what I think are really good examples of Greens use it locally in the UK, using those relationships with trade unions, because I think they're really exciting, and I think they help to show perhaps some of our best and the kind of thing that I certainly want to build on. So the one that springs to mind for me particularly is there's a councillor in Hackney, which is in East London, called Zoe Garbett. And so, she's an elected councillor on this local authority body, but she's very much in opposition to the Labour-controlled council, and a lot of Labour councils in London, are often dominated by a sort of managerial and quite right-wing group within the local Labour Party as well. Not all, but many of them. And within Hackney, Zoe did a lot of really good work as a Green candidate initially, and then as a councillor, in essentially prioritising the demands of local platform economy or gig economy workers who were being targeted by local police forces and by local council officials who wanted these delivery drivers, these gig workers, to stop parking their bikes and other vehicles on a particular street. And this was making life really difficult for those workers because they were food delivery workers, and if they couldn't park near the restaurants they needed to pick up food from, then it would cause them delays. And in many cases, I think some of those workers, lost their vehicles as a result, or at the very least, suffered fines and things like this. And so what Zoe was able to do was both sort of start building a relationship with those workers and the union that they were organising in locally, the Independent Workers Union, which I'm also a member of. But Zoe was also able to incorporate her campaign in support of those workers into her campaign literature that she was using to speak to residents in Hackney, where she was campaigning. And so I think she really demonstrated how it is possible for Green campaigners to tie in unions' priorities and show how they connect to the priorities of residents in their local area where they happen to be campaigning for election. And I think working on that model, Greens locally, whether that's in the UK or in the US, can really start to demonstrate that they will go the distance for trade unions and start to develop some of those relationships that way. So I just wanted to shout out to Zoe before we moved on, really.
Well, then let's move on to Ukraine Solidarity. And I met you, I think, at a meeting of the Ukraine Solidarity campaign where some of their members were reporting back from a recent trip to Ukraine. I actually ran into them in the Trade Union building in Kyiv when I was there. And, one of the things that impressed me coming out of that meeting, then we all went to, well, you sent a statement, but to this Hong Kong demonstration I referred to. And then I think the next day they had me at a demonstration of Friends for Standing Together on the Palestinian question. So there was a lot of solidarity, not just exclusively for this or that national liberation struggle. And what impressed me also about the Ukraine Solidarity campaign is that they have, unions involved, trade union leaders and activists, but also, unions, providing material support. So maybe you could describe something about that, and also just generally, how the Green Party in England and Wales regards the Ukrainian question, as well as, how the trade unions are relating to it through Ukraine solidarity activities.
Yeah, absolutely. So, looking at Ukraine Solidarity campaign, first of all, I've been hugely supportive of and hugely impressed by all the work they've done, not only in sort of rhetorical and political support for Ukraine within the UK, and especially within the UK's unions, but they've really translated that into loads of practical support, as you were saying, for Ukrainians on the front lines of the war. And that's included especially supplying Ukrainian workers with materials and support that they need to help people stay safe. They've given loads of support to fire and rescue personnel in particular, but they've also done some really amazing fundraising work, and I would encourage anyone who has a mind to visit their website, which I think is ukrainesolidarity.campaign.org.uk, but you can always just Google it and look at their latest fundraising campaign, because anything that you are able to give them, I'm sure would be hugely appreciated. And you can read more about their campaigns there. But in terms of the Green Party's sort of response to the war over the past 3 years. I mean, broadly speaking, I'm really proud that the Green Party of England and Wales has been really supportive of Ukrainian resistance. We've not equivocated. We've recognized that Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is something that needs to be resisted. And we as the UK, need to provide all the material support that Ukrainians need to resist Russia's invasion and ultimately to win a just peace, which secures Ukraine's independence, its sovereign borders, and doesn't leave any Ukrainians under occupation. So I'm really proud that we've taken that position. Now, clearly, in the past few weeks, the world has got, I think, increasingly dangerous, and especially for Ukrainians with the developments in the United States and the way that Donald Trump is trying to essentially, play with fire, play with Ukraine's future, having no regard for Ukrainians' right to determine their future collectively. And so I think it's really important that as Greens, we sort of maintain that support. And finally, I just wanted to address Howie, because as I was describing to you before we started this conversation, as some people might have seen in the last week, Britain's government, along with a lot of other European governments, has essentially pledged to increase military spending. And they framed this as a response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but also Donald Trump's behavior and the way that he has more or less signaled that Europe will be withdrawn from the American security umbrella. And so what we've seen over the past week is that the Labour government in power in the UK has said that it is going to increase military spending, and it's also taken that as an opportunity to cut welfare spending and benefit spending within the UK, which will harm thousands and maybe even millions of people over the next few years. So I think it's especially important that when we address this as Greens, we don't allow ourselves to be divided from the Ukraine solidarity campaign on this issue. I think it's really important that we stand up for welfare spending, for benefits, for the things that people need, for the security that people need. And we reject any cuts to welfare spending or any cuts to foreign and international aid. While at the same time, we have to maintain our support for Ukraine's defense. And we need to make the case that we are able to do that without making cuts in other areas. And we're able to do that without appreciably increasing military spending as well, by making use of the military hardware that we already have, and by making full use of financial sanctions and granting Ukrainians access to frozen Russian assets, of which there are at least £24 billion worth in the UK. So I think it's really important that we don't allow ourselves to be sort of thrown this way or that rhetorically, and that we maintain our support for Ukraine's defense, while also maintaining that we don't need to appreciably increase defense spending in the whole, but we need to make sure that the UK fully uses all of the financial and economic tools at its disposal as well to protect Ukraine.
Yeah, we put in the chat an article by Simon Pirani, which makes the argument Matthew just did. And it's a write-up of a presentation he made at a Ukraine Solidarity Conference in Brussels on Wednesday and Thursday with supporters of Ukraine and Ukrainians from all over Europe, meeting there in Brussels. And this was a question debated there. And, generally, the people on the left supporting Ukraine are saying, we already have weapons in the stock. We shouldn't, if we need to increase production to support Ukraine, it should go to that, not like in Britain to the Trident submarine, nuclear submarine. That's not really enhancing defense by escalating the nuclear problem. And, if need be, tax the rich, don't cut benefits for the rest of us. That's the basic argument. So, here in the US, unfortunately, even though, people who opposed arms to Ukraine said, well, if Ukraine wins, it's a victory for US imperialism. And they're saying the primary contradiction is US imperialism versus the rest. And so the Ukrainians are just a secondary contradiction. Too bad for them. We'll maybe deal with that after we get rid of US imperialism, which is a geopolitical argument, not a class analysis. it's shameful for people on the left to put that forward, but they are nonetheless. I mean, within an hour or so after Trump and Vance ambushed Zelensky in the Oval Office, Medea Benjamin of Code Pink, prominent pacifist, had a little video out saying Trump is right. You know, Ukraine could start World War III. When it's Russia that's been threatening, to use nukes since the very first days they went into Ukraine. They said if anybody outside of Ukraine arms Ukraine, it could start a nuclear war. So I'm wondering if in Britain, I know you've had campists who have had this geopolitical position. Have any of them changed their minds since Trump aligned with Putin against Ukraine? And therefore, if you're against U.S. imperialism, you got to be against the Putin-Trump alliance, I would think.
That's a really good question. And I must admit, Howie, I've not seen it. I've not seen the question posed to them in those terms, and I'd be very interested to see how they respond. Just first of all, to say that I completely share your perspective. I think that, that sort of campist analysis, as you've described it, is totally misbegotten. And it sees things from the perspective of geostrategy and geopolitics, rather than considering first the experience of working class people around the world, and then looking at how we can empower them to secure their freedom and secure the preconditions for socialism to develop in Ukraine, as I'm sure we would all want it to. In terms of whether people in Britain have reconsidered their position, I've not seen evidence of it. But I suppose we'll have to see how things develop. I think I mentioned to you that earlier today I was at a meeting hosted in Southeast London by, among others, Stand Up to Racism. But a lot of the discussions were around the UK government's recent decision to increase defence spending, which I think I mentioned previously. And so most of the discussion on the wider left that I've seen in the UK has been around the UK government's decision to increase military spending and the potential for UK involvement on the ground in Ukraine in the future. I think both things which people were very strongly against. So I imagine most of the discourse will be focused on the UK government's behaviour and less on the changing orientation of the United States. And I suppose the cynical way of looking at that is that it if you look at it that way from a British perspective, it prevents you from having to confront the fact that your previous analysis has just become redundant.
And I would think there would be a criticism of Starmer, at least from the viewpoint of Ukraine solidarity, because he seems schizophrenic. He's meeting with other European leaders to form this coalition of the willing to support Ukraine. And at the same time, he's keeping the door open to Trump, who's, from every indication is totally with Putin now. Yeah. And, just look at the latest iteration of this so-called minerals deal. It's worse for Ukraine. I mean, they want Ukraine to pay back the aid that the U.S. has already given, double that in terms of the number, up to $500 billion, and then basically control Ukraine's resources indefinitely into the future. I mean, you would think from the left point of view, this is Putin and Trump trying to cut a deal to carve up Ukraine between them. So you would think that the left would be going after Starmer for giving any credibility to what Trump is saying now. But is anybody saying that in the UK?
I think certainly from outside Starmer's circle, there are definitely criticisms of Starmer's closeness with, or attempt to be close with, Donald Trump. I think it's his behavior towards Donald Trump, I think, is really a symptom of this like peculiar sort of British right-wing politics behavior of wanting to be sort of a bridge between Europe and the United States. But I think we all know that that's both ridiculous sort of on its face, but also years and years out of date. Donald Trump, as you've pointed out, very much isn't interested in reconciling with a pro-Ukraine position. As you discussed, he's interested in collaborating with Vladimir Putin to carve up Ukraine's resources and exert a sort of neo-colonial control over them going into the future. So yeah, I think it's wildly misbegotten, and I think most people are quite critical of that.
Well, it's a whole new world with where Trump has aligned the United States now. And I think, how we respond to that politically is going to be important going forward. But let's talk about eco-socialists in the UK, in the US, and around the world. I know that you had a perspective. How is that perspective put forward? How far is it supported within the Green Party of England and Wales?
The eco-socialist perspective.
Yeah.
I think that's a good question. I think it would be quite hard for me, I think, to make grand statements about other Green parties around the world. There are some of them that I know a bit better, and there are some Green parties that have been in government in various European countries, and I think are very clearly not governed in an eco-socialist way. I think in particular the Green parties in Germany, in Austria, you could add Ireland to that list potentially, and a few others, I think have very much not exhibited that kind of perspective in the way that they've governed. I think certainly within the Green Party of England and Wales, I think there is a huge potential for eco-socialists to organise. I think eco-socialist perspectives and a suite of policies that you might describe as being eco-socialist are already hugely popular among the Green Party's base, among our most fervent supporters, and among our members who ultimately make our policy, elect our leaders, and so on. So I really think there's a huge potential within the Green Party of England and Wales. And I think the next step is really to take that popularity that eco-socialist policies already have and really to transform that into a deeper understanding. I think a more thorough program of political education to help people to really understand how a class analysis applies to green politics and how that should affect our worldview overall. And I think if we look to the work that Greens Organise have been doing, then we get a really good example of how that can be done. So Howie, I think you already know, but for anyone listening, Greens Organise is a group that was started by Green Party members on the left late last year. And it's still early days, but it was founded to provide a home for eco-socialists within the Green Party to get organised, to exert a positive influence on the Green Party of England and Wales at a hugely important time in its history when we've just elected these 4 Green MPs to Parliament, when we're working out what it's going to look like to be a radical anti-system and anti-capitalist socialist party, but from within the apparatus of the British state. And so I think it's a really important time for members of our party to be getting involved in that. And I'm really hopeful that it's going to turn into something really constructive. But I suppose to summarize, I think it's a really positive time for eco-socialists to be a really strong opposition to a right-wing Labour government. So bring it on.
Yeah, what you just said, I heard from a number of Greens when I was in London, that they're disappointed in what the German, Austrian, and Irish Greens have done, moved too far to the right. And the other thing you said, which I think would characterize the American Greens, is that there's a lot of support for eco-socialism, but we need a deeper understanding. So I think within the national platform of the Green Party, there are eco-socialist planks, an explicit statement in support of eco-socialism. But I think in the rank and file, what that means is not well thought through or understood. So that, that's why we got the Green Socialist Organizing Project to help, bring that perspective to more Greens. I know in Australia, the left seems to, be on the ascendance there. One of their co-leaders, Adam Bant, comes out of the socialist left and is, I'm going to be in Australia latter half of April, so I'm going to see this for myself. But it seems that, they have a very similar, platform in politics as the British Greens. And they've also been successful. They have elected now 4 members of their House, which is elected from single member districts like in Britain. That should give inspiration to us American Greens. we should have a caucus in the Congress, in the House of Representatives. Although in Australia, they do have the advantage of ranked choice voting, even though it's for a single seat, it eliminates the spoiler problem, which is, I'm sure it's a problem in Britain. It's a huge problem in the US because we don't have a tradition like Britain does of alternative parties that, actually compete with the Tories and Labour. I think, it'd be interesting to have, more organized or formalized connections between these left-green caucuses. Like I was looking but didn't find anybody in Germany with that perspective. In fact, what I found was the young Greens were getting angry at the old Greens, and a lot of their regional leadership, their Länder, that's like the states in the United States, resigned and joined Die Linke. But they only did that after Sarah Wagenknecht, this kind of red-brown politician, left and formed her own party. So there are a lot of developments there in eco-socialism around the world in relation to the Green parties. And then maybe you have some comments. There's the left party in Europe split, and the Green left split from the old left, left party, and it involves mainly Nordic and East European eco-socialist parties. It's called the European Left Alliance for the People and the Planet. Are you familiar with that? Is that, resonated at all among Greens in Britain?
I think the answer would be that if you were a keen watcher of European politics, it might be something that sticks with you. But for the most part, I think especially as, following Brexit, now we no longer participate in European elections. It's much less significant within the British left. Yeah. So I think it probably depends how much you pay attention. I will freely admit it's not something that I generally follow quite as closely as I should. So I'm not sure I can make any particularly enlightening comments about that. But I did want to just make a quick comment, if that's okay, about the Australian Greens and eco-socialism in Green parties overall. And I think it's really important for us to focus, for those of us who are eco-socialists, to focus on times when eco-socialism has been successful in the longer term within Green parties. Whereas I think it's quite easy to identify certain Green parties like the Austrian and German Greens, where, quite clearly, I think those parties have followed a path that I don't want to see the Green Party of England and Wales following. But I think it's just as important for us to identify those times when, Green parties have followed an eco-socialist path and to learn from each other in that way. When I'm speaking to people within trade unions, within the British left, especially within the socialist left, one thing that I quite often get told is, the German Greens are rubbish, so we can't trust the Greens in England and Wales because they'll just do what the Germans did. And if you're not particularly familiar with different Green parties, I can see how that might be an attractive line of argument. So I think it's really important for us to be able to draw a clear distinction between the socialist Green parties on the one hand and the more sort of liberal Green parties like the German Greens, and to be able to distinguish ourselves from them and to be able to make a really strong case for ourselves. Because I think if we don't, then people on the left will continue to associate us with those failed experiments on the continent, and that's not something I think that we want to see.
I agree with that. Just want to make one comment, and then let's open it to people's questions and comments. And that is, if people don't realize, the U.S. Greens are isolated from the international Green body, the Global Greens Congress, because we withdrew from the Green Federation of the Americas. And there was a political argument for that there's some right-wing Green parties in Latin America. I was of the position we should stay and fight rather than just cede the ground. And I would advocate that we get back involved, because when I visited Europe, and they wrote a letter, the German Greens wrote a letter saying Jill Stein should drop out and endorse Kamala Harris. And the Greens wrote back saying, The German Greens don't understand NATO, which, I think the German Greens are wrong to tell the Greens here to drop out, but U.S. Greens are wrong to tell them they don't understand. I mean, the first thing people would tell me when I met them at the European Greens Congress was, the Americans need to understand that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the biggest military operation since Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. And, they felt it was arrogant for the American Greens to lecture them about that. And it's kind of ironic that the American Greens are taking the same attitude toward Green parties around the world that Trump takes toward former U.S. allies in the past. So I think one thing on the agenda for American Greens is to get back into the international Green movement formally, so we have a seat at the table and we can talk about these issues. So that's my editorial for today. Let's see what questions and comments people have. Joanna Munley, trade unions usually consist of labor workers. How can we bring blue-collar office workers into unions, especially in the private sector? I think by labor she means work people who work with their hands.
Okay, I mean, did you want to go first, or shall I?
Well, you're the guest. Why don't you go first, and then I can add anything if I think I need to.
Okay, but yeah, very generous. Thank you. So I think in terms of like office work generally, I mean, one thing that I found in my experience is that it's really important, I think, to be sensitive to the particular dynamics of the offices that you're working in. I think quite often more sort of traditional structures of trade union organizing, more bureaucratic structures within within some office environments simply don't work as effectively. And I think it's important not to sort of get tied up in formalities and bureaucracy that way, but to be more flexible. I mean, that's certainly something that I found really useful when you're having conversations with people at the sort of like workplace level. I've also, spoken to a lot of people when I've been working that haven't been involved in trade unions before, and because they've often been quite young, they've maybe not been very familiar with what it actually means to be organised in a union and how that can actually improve your work on a day-to-day level, and how it can also help you to win better pay and conditions across the board as well. So I think it's really important when you're looking at a workplace where there isn't already an established union culture, to be prepared to start those conversations from a relatively sort of low level, and really just understand where people are coming from and sort of meet them halfway. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts, Howie?
Well, in the U.S., actually, where we've been gaining office workers is, that's where the unions have been gaining members. And as Joanna notes, especially in the public sector, we're not getting so many in the private sector. We've been losing workers in the industrial sector, the construction sector, and in the growing, what they call logistics now, basically trucking and warehousing and package delivery. We do have UPS. I was a Teamster in UPS. I got my union shirt on today. Where am I? Here we go. And, I unloaded trucks for decades. Aside from UPS, you got Amazon, FedEx, DHL, and the Postal Service is unionized. But that's a huge sector of, tens of thousands of workers that have a key role in making the economy run. In other words, if we had it all organized and had a strike, the economy would ground to a halt. We would have a lot of leverage. So I think we need to recover in the industrial construction and logistics sectors. And then, I think your advice for, office workers or service workers, like the Starbucks workers who are trying to unionize, you got to start low key talking to people about it. And then, hopefully you're part of a larger network that's organizing. That's why Starbucks is having some success, although they're in a big fight with a very anti-union company. So yeah, I think that's an area where we've got to grow the labor movement, certainly in the United States, and office workers have got to be a big part of that. Scout Trooper 164, do you think special forces being used as peacekeepers for the Russo-Ukrainian war will be hopeful if a peace deal is granted or not? Only asking because Russia has broken many deals.
I admit I'm struggling to understand the question. Is it whether special forces should be used?
I don't know if, I think the bigger question is any kind of forces, military forces from Britain, Western European countries, should be, well, will it be helpful if they're part of a peace deal?
Right, okay.
So I guess that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, my perspective on this, and I think it's something that I think Greens have to really reconcile. As a movement which I think in many ways grew out of the peace movement in the 20th century. Is really sort of how we address this. I mean, I must say that the prospect of seeing an international force like stationed in Ukraine is not fundamentally a really appetizing one, and that's because I think that it's something that we would all want to avoid. And I still think the most important thing is that we provide Ukraine with the resources that it needs to win a just peace in this war. And I think the real tragedy of this is that if the United States before Trump's election, if the UK and other countries in Europe had really used all of the tools at their disposal, both sort of military, but also economic aid as well, to support Ukraine in its war. If they'd actually done everything that they could to stop Russian tankers from transporting oil across the world, if they'd really secured energy independence earlier, so they weren't so beholden to Russia for oil and gas and for fertilizers and other things, then in that case, we might not even be having this conversation because Ukraine would have been in a much stronger position. But in the world that we're in, it's not something that I want to see happen. It's still, I think, not the most important thing in terms of sort of supporting Ukraine to resist Russian aggression and to win the war. I think it remains to be seen what kind of peace deal can actually be, or so-called peace deal will actually be brokered.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be a peace deal. Putin's going to drag this out. He thinks he's got the military upper hand. And I think, why Ukraine would want a peacekeeping force in there is basically they'd be a tripwire for a NATO intervention. Yeah. And they want to be part of NATO because then Article 5 would protect them. I think what, we, the West, should do is keep arming Ukraine, arm them. We were too little too late on all these weapon systems that Biden would mull over for months, in some cases years. Things like Patriot air defense missiles, just to protect them from Russian missiles bombing cities. And so we provided enough for Ukraine not to lose, but not enough for them to defeat the invading Russian army and send them back to Russia. And the other fact is the Ukrainian military is much more competent in fighting this kind of war than the troops that would come in from, say, Britain. I mean, Britain's armed forces are down to 70, 80,000, men in arms. That's small. That's tiny. They have basically relied on the NATO nuclear umbrella and their own nuclear umbrella. That's why they're putting all the money into the Trident submarine instead of conventional forces. The question mentioned special forces. You don't need special forces. You need conventional armed forces, in this kind of fight, although special forces are used in tactical situations. But generally, we should give Ukraine the military means it needs to defend itself. And then on the other side, Russia is still, they've got a shadow fleet of over 800 tankers that are selling their oil all over the world. And we know who those tankers are. If you go to Razum We Stand, Google that. Svetlana Romanko, who we've had on this podcast twice, she's a climate activist. She used to work with 350.org covering Ukraine, the Caucasus, and what do you call that area? The south, the southern part of the Eurasian continent. The stands south of Russia. And, then she started Razum We Stand, which is trying to tighten fossil fuel sanctions on Russia and rebuild Ukraine on renewable energy. Not only because it's good for the climate, which is, a big thing for her, but also it's easier to defend decentralized, dispersed solar panels and wind generators and microgrids than centralized power plants with, all on one big grid. So that, Russia hasn't felt the full force that sanctions could provide. And Ukraine talks about they provide their own sanctions when they strike these oil refineries and, oil and gas distribution facilities. That's been the most effective thing they've done, which brings back to the so-called deals that the U.S. In Saudi Arabia earlier this week said they came away with. First, they said we have a ceasefire on energy strikes, and Putin is basically saying, "Well, yeah, but we're interested in that, but," and then they add a bunch of conditions like recognize the 4 oblasts they only partially control as Russian territory, and then on the other thing, the ceasefire in the Black Sea, Ukraine already basically disarmed the Russian Black Fleet. They can't patrol the Western Black Sea. Ukraine reopened its trade lane there for its grain exports and the imports it needs. And Russia has like 26 vessels at the bottom of the Black Sea because of these drone boats. Ukraine didn't even have a navy, and they defeated the Russian Black Fleet. So I don't know what Ukraine gets out of that, but that's what the Trump people come back and call that a peace deal. Everything that's coming out of these negotiations is demands on Ukraine and concessions to Russia. So I don't think there's going to be a peace deal. I think, Putin's going to drag it out. Ukraine is going to say, okay, we'll go along. But basically, they're throwing the ball back in the court and trying to show that Russia really doesn't want to stop the war. They still want to control all of Ukraine. So I think the peacekeepers, the military deployment is kind of a red herring to this whole debate. Ukraine needs military support, sanction support, economic support for its public budget in Ukraine, and so they can hold on while the Russians, who are losing a lot, I mean, they've lost nearly 1 million soldiers, casualties. By May, it'll probably be 1 million. That's many times more than they lost in Afghanistan. And, they had to withdraw from Afghanistan, and a lot of people say that's part of the reason why the Soviet Union fell apart. So, the contradictions, what do they say, the chickens are going to come home to roost in Russia because of this war at some point. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts on that question. Andrew Hager, Matthew, where does the Green Party of England and Wales stand on heritage rail and keeping steam and diesel locomotives running for future generations while cutting down the carbon footprint with new fuels?
Okay, thank you. So just to check that I've understood this question correctly, it's asking whether we should keep steam and diesel locomotives running but use replacement fuels to mitigate the climate impacts. Have I got that?
I think that's what he's talking about. Andrew likes, he's a train, guy. And, but also maybe you could talk about, I know that the Green Party of England and Wales wants to renationalize the railroads that Thatcher privatized.
I mean, I'm on safer territory there. I will freely admit that in many of the more specialized conversations, I'm not always the policy expert to go to. So I'm afraid I'll have to not answer the question asked, because it's simply not something that I'm very familiar with. But yeah, I mean, in terms of governance of the railways, yeah, we've been very consistent for many years that we need to see the UK's privatised railway system brought back into democratic public ownership. If you're listening from the United States or elsewhere, you may or may not know, but Britain has a particularly confusing and inefficient privatized railway system, in which the services are provided to passengers by private companies on sort of long-term contracts from the government, but where they consistently fail to give passengers the service they need. They consistently fail to ensure that services run on time. They fail to provide adequate staffing or adequate pay for their staff as well. And on the other hand, even the trains themselves, the rolling stock, is still held in private hands. And so a huge amount of private profit is extracted from our railways. Now, the Labour government, to its credit, has pledged to bring those railway company contracts back into public hands. And so you wouldn't have these private train providers. But they've said nothing about bringing the trains themselves, the rolling stock, back into public ownership. And it's from the payments on that rolling stock. That's where most of the private profit gets extracted from the system anyway. So yeah, in the Green Party, we're very clear that it all needs to be brought into democratic public ownership. And I don't know whether you've got strong opinions on the use of alternative fuels. Howie, maybe you can answer the question.
Well, generally, and I've talked to Andrew about this before, I mean, there are some, he talks about heritage rails, some lines that traditionally, were steam engines, puffing out the exhaust, and then diesel locos, diesel locomotives, I mean, they basically are used to create an electric charge to power the motor. So there are other ways of generating electricity than diesel. So I'm not sure of that. If, a niche, for basically tourists, steam engines, yeah, fine. But generally, we need to electrify transportation, including the railroads, for reasons of, air pollution and climate stability. Scout Trooper 164, any thoughts on the GDP capsizing for the UK?
So this is a question about the UK's GDP being stagnating over several years. I mean, I suppose in the Green Party generally, and just I think throughout the environmental justice movement, I mean, we're clear generally that GDP in itself shouldn't be the measure of progress. I don't judge a country's progress by its domestic product overall, but by the security and well-being and justice that it can provide for people living there, and the contribution it can make to the world as well, and to the well-being of the planet. With that said, I think in many ways the way that the British economy has stagnated, and you can see that reflected in the way that GDP growth has been really sluggish, is a really clear symptom of the way that Britain's economy has been mismanaged over the past 40 years. The Thatcher governments and following, I think, have given a great amount of attention to the City of London, to financial services. And I think they've encouraged a very speculative model of economic development, which is focused on inflating asset prices. And I think at the same time, we've seen investment in productive industries, in particular in the new green industries that we need to see develop. We've seen that investment fall dramatically. And so, yeah, we've got a particularly unproductive economy. Labour productivity is relatively low. Investment is relatively low. And I think, we're really seeing the long-term impacts of that in the stagnation that we see in Britain. And I think it's absolutely critical that that a Green government, upon coming to power, would totally reverse that trend by kickstarting investment in the industries that we need to see grow and develop in order to transition to a zero carbon economy, and at the same time wind back those industries which are so damaging to people and planet.
Yeah, when you said the City of London, that's the financial sector in London. That's like Wall. When you say City of London in the UK, it means like Wall Street in
precisely.
the US. If people didn't get that. My only comment on that is whatever Britain does, Trump is a problem. He's getting ready to tank the world economy between his tariffs, his devastation of the public sector, which will remove a lot of demand from the economy, and the firing of tens of thousands of federal workers, which will reduce consumer demand in the economy. I mean, it's like if you were trying to wreck the U.S. and world economy, you do what Trump is doing. So, good luck to all of us in the UK and the US. It's
we'll need it.
We're in for hard times, I'm afraid. So, Matthew, any last words for people over here?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation and thought it was really thought-provoking. I know I'll be thinking through some of the things that we both said for quite a while. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to seeing some of your later episodes as well on your travels.
Yeah, one of those people is your co-author, Victoria Ball, who is a British Ukrainian who's in the Green Party of England and Wales, who I met also at that meeting of the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. And originally we're going to have both of you on together, but the scheduling didn't work out, probably for the better, because you got to develop your thoughts more fully, and then Victoria will later on. We don't have a date for Victoria yet, but it'll probably be in May. So that's coming up. So yeah, be sure to tune into that one. And I will actually be doing some of the podcasts from Papua New Guinea in April with the Benny Wanda, the leader of the West Papua Liberation Movement, which is a struggle that people over here really don't know much about, but it's a brutal occupation by the Indonesian government, backed by the U.S. government. And then I'll be in Australia to find out how they've been able to do what Americans have not, and that is, and I think they've done it as the UK Greens have done it by really, putting roots down in their communities and building a base so they can get elected to their national parliament, as well as their state and local offices in much larger numbers than we've been able to do. So that's coming up. I don't have a guest for next Saturday, which is the last one before I leave, but I may have one. There's some people that have talked about coming on. We'll see what happens in the next couple of days. If not, we'll just discuss, what we got to do in Trump time. And so we'll be here next Saturday, same time, same place. Thanks everybody for being here. Thank you, Matthew, for being here. And we'll see everybody next week.
Thanks, Howie. See you.